In the summer of 2019, millions of Australians fell asleep beneath an orange sky, believing it was just another dry season. But before that season ended, over 18 million hectares of forest had burned, an area roughly the size of the state of Washington and Oregon combined. Nearly 3 billion animals died or lost their habitat, a figure ecologists have called unprecedented in recorded natural history. This was the largest bushfire event ever recorded on the Australian continent since meteorological records began, and it happened the very year science had predicted. The question was never why Australia burns, but why this time everything burned all at once. To answer that, we have to begin with the Australian ground itself, a continent nature built to burn, but never quite like this. Australia is an old, flat, and dry continent, where eucalyptus trees co-evolved with fire over tens of millions of years. Eucalyptus leaves are packed with flammable oil, their peeling bark creates natural kindling, and their seeds only germinate after exposure to intense heat. Indigenous Australians understood this for thousands of years, using controlled burning on a cyclical basis to clear fuel loads and prevent catastrophic accumulation. But throughout the 20th century, traditional burning practices were progressively curtailed, and fuel loads began building in forest understories across decades. At the same time, Australia was enduring an exceptional decade-long dry period known as the Millennium Drought, which stretched from 1997 to 2009. In 2019, Australia recorded simultaneously its hottest and driest year on record, with national average temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in December. Australia's Bureau of Meteorology fire danger rating reached catastrophic, the highest level on the scale, across more than 30 regions simultaneously. In September of 2019, the first major fires ignited in Queensland and New South Wales, 2 full months earlier than the typical fire season. Volunteer fire crews were mobilized from September, beginning what would become 8 consecutive weeks of firefighting with no end in sight. On the 18th of November 2019, a new pulse of hot inland wind drove toward the eastern seaboard, and everything shifted. The slow-motion bomb had been set over decades, and now it was detonating across the entire eastern coastline of the continent. To understand why these fires were different from anything Australia had experienced, we need to talk about a phenomenon called pyrocumulonimbus, or fire-generated thunderstorm clouds. When a fire grows large enough, the thermal energy it releases drives an updraft so powerful it generates its own thunderstorm cell directly above, reaching 30 kilometers into the atmosphere. These fire thunderstorm cells produce dry lightning with no rainfall, surface vortex winds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, and hurl burning embers up to 10 kilometers ahead of the main front. During the 2019 to 2020 fire season, Australia recorded 23 pyrocumulonimbus events, a global record. Think of it this way: each of those fire thunderstorm cells had the capacity to collapse every firefighting plan in place within minutes, generating new ignitions faster than crews could respond. In December 2019, the Gospers Mountain Fire, northwest of Sydney, burned for 79 consecutive days, consuming over 500,000 hectares. This was the single largest fire ever recorded in New South Wales history, and it was just one of dozens burning simultaneously across the continent at that moment. On the 21st of December, smoke from New South Wales fires blanketed Sydney, driving air quality index readings to 11 times the hazardous threshold. Sydney's sky turned deep red-orange at midday, and air monitoring stations recorded fine particulate PM2.5 concentrations, exceeding even Beijing on its worst pollution days. Meanwhile, along the south coast of New South Wales, tens of thousands of people converged on small beaches because they were the only open spaces not surrounded by burnable vegetation. This was not just a wilderness disaster. It was a disaster that surrounded coastal communities, severed road access, and trapped tens of thousands of people with fire on three sides and the ocean at their backs. On the 31st of December 2019, the sky above the coastal town of Mallacoota in Victoria turned completely black by 9 in the morning, not night, not storm clouds. It was smoke so dense it had completely swallowed the sun, turning a midsummer day into absolute darkness in a matter of minutes. The Australian Navy deployed the warship HMAS Chulz to evacuate civilians by sea because no road or air route could reach Mallacoota at that point. At the same time in New South Wales, two massive fires, Currowan and Clyde Mountain, merged into a single fire complex spanning over 1 million hectares. When two large fire fronts merge, they generate their own internal wind system, which means there is no longer a predictable wind direction. The fire can reverse course at any moment without warning. Think about what it means when a fire, larger than most European countries, is generating its own weather system, and human beings can only stand at its periphery and watch. The most extreme day was the 4th of January 2020, when temperatures across much of coastal New South Wales exceeded 48 degrees Celsius, accompanied by strong foehn-effect winds. On that day, the Currowan fire tore across the Princes Highway, completely isolating the New South Wales south coast from the rest of the country. This was no longer simply a firefighting problem. It had become a national-scale logistics crisis with hundreds of thousands of people cut off from supply chains. Hundreds of homes, fire stations, and entire small villages disappeared within hours as the fire front advanced at speeds exceeding 80 kilometers per hour. Among the 3,000 communities affected along Australia's east coast, many lost all of their emergency service infrastructure simultaneously. Try to grasp that scale differently. It was as if the entire emergency service network across an area the size of Great Britain had been disabled in a single night. At the crisis peak, tens of thousands of hectares burned every single day, the equivalent of incinerating a major national park from the map every 24 hours, day after day, with no end date visible. In Victoria, the East Gippsland and Northeast Victoria, fires merged into a single superfire complex that continued burning well into February of 2020. Victoria's mountain ash forest, home to the tallest flowering plants on Earth, lost over 80% of its remaining extent, having already been severely reduced by the 2009 Black Saturday fires. Within those forests lived hundreds of species endemic to Australia, found nowhere else on Earth, and many of them faced immediate extinction risk as their last remaining habitat burned. The koala, Australia's most iconic species, lost over 30% of its Queensland and New South Wales habitat in a single fire season, an event that pushed the species closer to endangered status nationally. In total, scientists from the University of Sydney estimated that nearly 3 billion mammals, birds, and reptiles were killed or displaced from the burnt zones. 3 billion individual animals, a figure the human mind cannot naturally comprehend. But consider it this way: more than 3 times the entire human population of the North American continent gone in a single season. Meanwhile, on Kangaroo Island, off the South Australia coast, one of the most pristine wildlife reserves in Australia, fire consumed over 48% of the island's total land area. The island's Kangaroo Island dunnart and glossy black cockatoo populations, subspecies found nowhere else on Earth, lost over half their individuals in a single night. The smoke from Australia's fires did not stay in Australia, and that is what made this event exceptional, even by the standards of global climate scientists. Smoke from the Black Summer fires circumnavigated the globe within 2 weeks and was detected by NASA tracking systems in the stratosphere at altitudes of 25 kilometers. Carbon dioxide emissions from the Black Summer fires reached approximately 730 million tons, nearly double Australia's entire annual CO2 output under normal conditions. The smoke was dense enough to measurably cool surface temperatures in the Southern Ocean and triggered algal blooms in deep water as iron from forest ash precipitated into the ocean beneath the plume. Then, in February 2020, what no one had dared hope for finally arrived. Rain. Heavy, widespread rainfall across the fire zones that extinguished many of the largest fires. But the rain brought a second disaster. Water falling onto fire-denuded hillsides, stripped of all ground cover, generated flash floods and debris flows that struck communities that had survived the fires. Soil that had been completely stripped of vegetative cover could not absorb rainfall, meaning every rain event became a flash flood risk across the fire-affected landscape for months afterward. Dozens of streams and drinking water catchments were heavily contaminated by ash and soil erosion, pushing forest-edge communities into a prolonged clean water crisis lasting many months. And in coastal waterways along eastern Australia, floodwaters carrying eucalyptus ash created sudden acidification events in estuaries and bays, triggering mass fish die-offs from oxygen depletion. This is the domino effect of large-scale natural disaster. Each rainfall event following the fire reopened the wound in a different way, extending the disaster's reach far beyond its visible boundaries. Combining all impacts, the Black Summer fire season destroyed over 3,000 structures, including more than 2,500 private homes, and directly affected more than 170 communities. 33 people died directly in the fires, and subsequent medical research estimated an additional approximately 400 deaths attributable to smoke-related respiratory illness across Australia. Among the 33 were an American and a Canadian aerial firefighter from international support crews who died when their air tanker crashed in New South Wales while on a retardant drop mission. Over 65,000 volunteer firefighters served throughout the fire season, many operating without adequate rest for consecutive weeks while maintaining their regular employment and family responsibilities. The Australian Defence Force was called up for domestic disaster relief for the first time in its history, a mobilisation announced by Prime Minister Scott Morrison in early January of 2020. Dozens of nations dispatched firefighting crews, aircraft, and equipment, including the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and multiple European countries, constituting one of the largest international disaster assistance operations in history. And then, in March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Australia, erasing almost all remaining global attention from the still-healing fire disaster. When the fires were over, what remained was the question Australia had to confront as the last smoke finally cleared in early 2020. Total direct and indirect economic losses were estimated at over $100 billion, a significant portion driven by the collapse of tourism to the eastern, coastal and national park regions. The South Coast New South Wales tourism industry, a multi-billion-dollar sector entirely dependent on the summer season, lost an entire season's revenue in a matter of weeks. Yet nature began recovering in ways that both surprised and concerned scientists, because the pace of recovery depended entirely on what came next. Eucalyptus trees sprouted green epicormic growth directly from their charred trunks through an evolutionary mechanism called epicormic resprouting. But many other tree species in the understory had no such recovery capacity. Moreover, many areas had burned so intensely that even fire-adapted species could not regenerate because the heat had destroyed seed banks in the soil itself, a threshold scientists call ecological reset. Scientists from the University of Wollongong and the University of New South Wales issued warnings that if a similar event recurred within the next decade, much of eastern Australia's forest would be unable to return to its previous ecological state. A decade. That is the minimum recovery window these forest ecosystems need before accumulating enough fuel load to support another natural fire cycle, and that decade is becoming shorter than it once was. Australian terrain was permanently altered across many regions. Streams carried red sediment and black ash for months, and several coastal areas experienced measurable shoreline changes from post-fire erosion deposits, and high in the atmosphere, aerosol from the fire smoke measurably altered rainfall patterns across a wide area of the southern hemisphere for months after the fires ended. Since then, Australia has committed to a new national framework for bushfire management, but the largest questions remain without fully satisfying answers. This was also never only Australia's story. The smoke that circled the Earth reminded the entire planet that this is everyone's story. Following Black Summer, the Australian government established a Royal Commission into Natural Disaster Arrangements, which published 274 recommendations in 2021. Among the most significant changes was major investment in restoring Indigenous traditional controlled burning knowledge, a program that many scientists consider the most effective long-term answer to fuel load management. Australia also expanded its natural hazard observation network, adding hundreds of weather stations and strengthening fire danger forecasting systems based on numerical climate modeling. But these reforms raised a larger question. Are they moving fast enough to keep pace with a climate that is changing faster than the models projected? Because 2019, Australia was not an anomaly. According to the Bureau of Meteorology, every single one of the 10 hottest years in Australian recorded history has occurred after 2000. Climate scientists at CSIRO have warned that by 2050 days, meeting catastrophic bushfire conditions in Australia could occur 3 to 4 times more frequently than they do today. Australia is not alone in this. The Amazon is burning more frequently. The western United States and Canada are experiencing their most extreme fire seasons on record, and Mediterranean forests are shrinking under record temperatures. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, nations experiencing progressively longer dry seasons and increasingly fragmented forest cover, are appearing in scientists' calculations as emerging high-risk fire zones in the decades ahead. And this is what scientists agree on most clearly. The risk is not whether fire will come again. Fire always comes. The risk is how large the next one will be if the conditions that need to change remain unchanged. Each major fire event depletes animal populations, destroys seed banks, and erodes the forest's carbon absorption capacity, further warming the climate and setting conditions for the next fire to burn even more intensely. Scientists call this a positive feedback loop between climate change and wildfire, a cycle with no natural endpoint once it has been set in motion at sufficient scale. 3 billion animals, 18 million hectares, and a summer that Australians call simply the Black Summer, because no single word is adequate for what it was. That orange sky that millions of Australians fell asleep beneath in September 2019 was not the sign of an ordinary summer. It was the sky of a continent bearing the accumulated weight of decades of unburned fuel load and temperatures it had never experienced before in its recorded history. And that sky was also a warning, one that was visible to anyone looking up, but one that required the catastrophe itself to make fully understood. Climate scientists from CSIRO published reports predicting extended extreme bushfire conditions in Australia in 2017, 2 full years before the Black Summer ignited. The models ran correctly, the forecasts were accurate, the warnings were written in full, but the gap between scientific evidence and policy decision remained, and in many places continues to remain. This is the common challenge of every natural disaster in the 21st century. Not a shortage of information, but a shortage of will to act before the catastrophe becomes unavoidable. The blackened forests of New South Wales and Victoria, the beaches overwhelmed with evacuees, and the fire thunderstorm cells generating their own weather, all permanently changed how Australia sees itself. Because Australia had always been a land of fire. But before Black Summer, most Australians still thought of fire as something that happened somewhere else. In remote regions, in the countryside, not in Sydney, not next to their own homes. Black Summer shattered that illusion completely, pulling fire to the doorstep of 3/4 of Australia's population who live along the eastern seaboard. That shift changed a national conversation, reshaped an election, and altered how an entire country envisions its future on a warming planet. But shifting awareness is only the first step. What scientists and affected communities alike emphasize is that concrete action must keep pace with that awareness. Meanwhile, in the recovering forests from Black Summer, eucalyptus trees have grown back, birds have returned, and some smaller animal species have begun re-establishing populations in recent years. But more than 400 plant and animal species listed or uplisted on threatened species registers following Black Summer have not recovered sufficiently to be removed from those lists. And within that context, the debate about the speed and scale of climate response continues. In Australia, in every forested nation, and in every place that will bear the consequences of those decisions. Because what happened in Australia in the summer of 2019 was not a preview of the future. It was the present. And that present is expanding. That summer also posed a question without a simple answer. How do you protect communities, ecosystems, and the planet's biological diversity from something that grows stronger with each passing year? Part of the answer comes from those who have lived with fire the longest. Indigenous Australians who understand that forest is not something to be protected from fire, but something that must live with fire on the right cycle. And part of the answer comes from science. Better early warning systems, more accurate fire behavior modeling, and a commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to slow the feedback loop. Neither answer is sufficient alone. Only in combination do they move at the pace required to keep up with what we are facing. The smoke from Black Summer circled the Earth in 2 weeks, but the lesson it carried will require decades to be fully absorbed into policy, into action, and into our collective habits. There are forests in New South Wales and Victoria recovering slowly today, greening year by year, unaware that the atmospheric conditions that created Black Summer remain embedded in the air above them. And on the beaches, where tens of thousands once stood in darkness on the last day of 2019, life has returned to normal. Families spreading picnic blankets, children running along the sand. That is the miracle of human resilience. And it is also its danger, because memory fades and urgency dims as ordinary life returns, and the orange sky becomes just a story. The orange sky of the summer of 2019 is still there, in the memory of millions of Australians, in the data of the satellites overhead, and in the tree rings of the forest growing back. That summer stretched across 18 million hectares, 3 billion lives, and an orange sky the whole world saw. And the question it asked is still waiting for our answer.